Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it's a very wet evening, and a number of you, when you got out of your cars in the car park, stood in sort of amazing puddles and that kind of thing. Sorry about that. I appreciate also that getting into the college these days is more difficult than it was, and I'm very grateful to Beverly for frisking you, or whatever she did, on the way in. Before I introduce the speaker, just two further thank yous. First of all, if I can thank Rachel Brennan here, who is the college librarian. And the reason we have decided to have the talk this evening here is because in her role, she's anxious to increase the level of pupil engagement with these wonderful books and resources that we have here. Unfortunately, you'll notice there aren't so many pupils or students around, and the reason is because the Lancashire Cup final, which was due to be taking place last Wednesday, was postponed, and it's now today, or this evening. So about 300 children have been bussed out to somewhere, and they're now much wetter even than your feet. But if I can also say a huge thank you, on the emails and the sort of Instagrams or whatever else was used to connect to you, you might have seen a clip of film, and it was produced by a wonderful young man. You can see at the back. I'm talking to him through this microphone, and a man called Elliot Hartley, and fantastically skillful. We'll see the film, I think, later on. So thank you very much for those two people. Our speaker this evening, some of you will know very well. I think the first time I met him was probably over 25 years ago, and I think it was the second edition, the anniversary of The Land That Lost Its Heroes. One of his earlier works about the Falklands crisis, Falklands War. The last time I saw him, I think we were in the bath together in Lourdes, but probably I think what happens in Lourdes stays in Lourdes. But, and if you're wondering why I've got so much money on me, it's because the books have been selling very, very well. We've got two left, a special discount, the book he's talking about this evening. And if anyone would like a copy, if you want, what am I saying? If we run out, if you give me your name, I'll make sure some are sent to you. So Jimmy Burns is going to speak this evening about his latest book. There's lots of his books here on display. A Faithful Spy. And it's very well received, very well promoted, and we're looking forward to it. So thank you very much, Jimmy, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for inviting me, and it's always a joy to come back to the college. I'm OS 71. You can imagine how the college has changed since then. But it's always, I walk down. The first thing I do, I book into the Sherborne and then sort of walk down the avenue, and I just sort of always get reminded about, what's so special about this place as you approach it, and it really is how this building is framed by this extraordinary landscape, and it gives you a real sense of freedom, really. This idea that somehow people go to schools and that they're sort of enclosed. You almost breathe liberty as you walk down the avenue, and obviously it's hugely powerful to have the Virgin behind you and the Eagle Towers in front. Look, what I just thought what I would do is the other thing is I'm just overwhelmed by the amount of people who turned up, actually, and I think it's Jason over there gave me a very good sort of little anecdote to start off with, which is he remembered Paddy Ashdown turning up and in a totally almost empty room, and he had the media out there and all that, so he basically said, can you bring in more chairs? There are a lot of people on their way, and of course it was all complete invention, but it's good to see such an amazing turnout, and despite the core of rugby over spies, it's great to see some poetry people over there, and as I've told them, I hope they won't shy away from asking questions, because this is for them as much as for the veterans, and I use that word with all due respect. What I thought I'd do is the sort of first part of what I wanted to talk about, because I thought might interest you, is I would say the world of spies and my involvement with it as a journalist over the years, which will be partly anecdotal, and then that will lead me into the book. And obviously I want to leave time for a flowing discussion, questions. So I will talk for about 45 minutes. I will keep myself very disciplined, and then I hope we'll have about 15 minutes minimum of open to you for any questions you want to ask about anything I've said or what I haven't said. I thought I'd begin particularly to try and generate involvement from poetry back there, but how many of you youngies, with all due respect, have thought of joining the intelligence services? One person over here. Second question. Maybe you could answer it, but when you think of MI6, the Foreign Intelligence, the Secret Intelligence Service, as they're called, SIS, what spy do you think of?
Not the one like James Bond, not the one that's with all the explosions and the fancy guns and everything, the one that's undercover and doesn't get talked about.
My God, he should have written the book. Well, you're absolutely right, because the first thing is I can tell you with total certainty from talking to my friends in MI6 is that when Dr. No was published, which is, as you probably recall, the first of the Ian Fleming books and turned into the first movie, with how can one forget Ursula Andress coming out of the water in a bikini, but certainly I was about 10 at the time, and I felt a slight stirring of something. But I don't want to be frivolous, but the spies are not anything like James Bond, but what James Bond did was contribute at the time to an extraordinary recruitment for British intelligence, because you had a whole lot of particularly public school boys coming out thinking, we're going to have people like Ursula Andress and various women behind them, and it's going to be great stuff, and I'm going to be jumping up in the air with special gizmos and a sort of mixture of Mission Impossible and Jack Reacher today. The other thing I thought would be interesting is to share with you, which is for obvious reasons not public knowledge, but we're in a family here in a way. What are the kind of profile of people that MI6 in particular is looking for? And it'll probably surprise you the kind of criteria that they use. And it might just touch echoes with maybe the Ignatian spirit subconsciously. But as it was explained to me, the first thing that happens is that obviously they look at hundreds of applications, and unfortunately, like so many things today, human resource, they're outsourced to a human resource techo lot who put it through a system, and then it shifts on the basis of answers to certain questions that computers churned out. And then from that, they cut down the selection process to people who actually get interviewed face-to-face for the first time. And they go to a secret location, they sign the Official Secrets Act. They're not meant to say, even if they don't get the job, that they've even been interviewed for the thing. And there you get into a pretty interesting interviewing process where the following criteria are borne in mind. The first one might be an obvious one, which is intellectual rigor or prowess, which basically comes down to having a pretty good degree and a pretty good reference from your tutor and indeed from your headmaster or whoever taught you at school. But that's a fairly obvious one. And certainly that would not get you straight into MI6. The other one is curiosity. They're looking for people who are curious about people and about the world. Linked to that, they're looking for young people who haven't simply stuck inside a kind of what I would call a trajectory of an educational box, going to school, going to university, going into a job. They're looking for people who have found the time in that period to think outside the box, to travel, to volunteer, work among refugees, go to the far-flung places in Africa, Asia, move around Europe, because they're looking for people who are interested in other cultures, who engage in other cultures, and who can see the world through the eyes of other cultures. The other thing they're looking for, and this will surprise some of you, is integrity, playing truth in everything you're doing, truth to yourself and what you believe in. And linked to that is a sense of humility. A sense of humility, which they pick up in the interviewing process, is they will ask you a question of, think of something where you made a terrible mistake and you really regretted it. Now, if one of the interviews says, I've never made a mistake, he's probably out. Because making mistakes in your life from an early stage just makes you human. It doesn't exclude you. You learn from your mistakes, and if you've got the strength of mind and will, you'll overcome that. And the final thing is the newspaper that I worked for 30 years, the Financial Times, has as its motto, beyond fear or favour, which is a great motto, because what it means is that you confront power with truth. So you are never overawed by people simply because they're powerful. It doesn't matter if they're presidents, heads of banks, politicians, everyone's human. So you have an open mind about their honesty, whether they're saying the truth or not, and you don't necessarily obey orders. You've got to think for yourself. Now, please bear this in mind when we get to discussing the book and the character of Walter Bell, the subject of the book. But in this part, I wanted simply to share with you, on a very personal front, how it was that I came to the world of intelligence. Well, basically, I came into the world of intelligence because through my journalism. I got into journalism, and I've written about this before and said this in publicly before, that I owe a lot to my Jesuit education. Obviously, I'm OS 71. It was a very different place, this, and it had lots of things going on which, thank God, don't go on anymore, like ferrers and, the committee birching you and all that, which, corporal punishment was gone. And we were a single-sex school, which again, I'm very glad to see that that went as well. And I think people, thank God, the new generation are much more at home with their sexuality, whatever it is, and they're not afraid to talk about it. But my journalism, I suppose I struck lucky, like we all struck lucky. I went to university. I did a undergraduate at University College London in modern Iberian and Latin American studies, and then I did a postgrad degree at London School of Economics in politics and government. As a result of that, I joined the BBC for a while, then Yorkshire Television, and then at the age of 25, I was recruited by the Financial Times, and within 2 months was sent on my first foreign posting, which was to Lisbon at the end of the 70s in the middle of the Cold War. And one of the first people that approached me was the TASS correspondent. For those not familiar with Russian media, TASS is the official media outlet of the communist regime as it was then. And the TASS correspondent, wherever he was a KGB operative, basically. And he assumed, he was called Sergei, I remember Sergei, he was a great big, square Russian heavy drinker. And he assumed that because, despite my young age, that working for the FT, I was probably working with MI6 at the same time. So Sergei insisted that every Friday we would meet for lunch. But before doing that, we had to meet in an underground car park because he thought we might be followed, and we had to change our restaurant every time we met every Friday. The whole thing was absurd because I just fed him chicken feed, as they say, and I got much more out of him than he got out of me, not least one famous night when me and a colleague from Reuters invited him and a Russian colleague to supper, and we laid out whiskey bottles and vodka bottles, and of course the Russians, what they really wanted was whiskey, good whiskey, and we had good whiskey. So what we'd do is we'd fix the drinks, give them the whiskey, and then the vodka we'd completely water down, and we would be drinking the vodka. So by about halfway through the evening, the Russians were absolutely pissed out as news. Well, not quite pissed as news, but they started really talking beyond their brief. And I realized then, because they started really criticizing the communist system and saying how it was all falling apart, and Brezhnev was, the Politburo was just not responding to the people. And reflecting on that, I realized, this was the beginning of the end of the Iron Curtain. Just to fast forward to my next posting, I arrived in Argentina, Buenos Aires, at the end of '81, and as most of you know, there was not really a small war, because Mrs. Thatcher launched the biggest naval operation since World War II, and the Royal Navy in its entirety headed towards these South Atlantic islands, which frankly most people had never heard of, beyond the penguins and the fact that quite a few people were sheep shearers. So I suddenly found myself on a big story, obviously, as the only full-time correspondent at that time in Buenos Aires when the war broke out. And I was obviously under a lot of pressure. Halfway through the war, I was arrested by the military junta on suspicion of being a spy. Now, again, what I'm telling you, none of it is invention, but you know, reflecting on it, it's almost like a kind of a comedy of errors, really. In May of the Falklands War, I thought that I was under a lot of stress, and my dear wife, who was an English teacher and had her whole school closed down by the military junta, had to go across the River Plate to Montevideo, had come back to join me. And I said, look, why don't we just go off for a weekend on an internal flight, and let's go to to see the Iguazu Falls by Brazil, which we'd always wanted to go and see. And so there we were in the internal airport of Buenos Aires, getting ready to board the plane, when we were surrounded by security people who took my knapsack, as it was, and produced two things that I had in it. One was a little Minox camera, which I just rather liked because they were so small you could just take them everywhere. But of course they were used in World War II for photographing secret documents and things, but also became standard issue during the Cold War. In my case, it was for total personal use. But the other thing I had was a map of the area around Iguazu Falls, which is the province of Misiones, which had a whole lot of crosses marked on it, which I'd marked. And so I was taken into the interrogation. My wife was taken into another interrogation room. And so we didn't know what was happening to each other. It was very nasty. It was psychological torture of the worst possible kind. And at one point, they sort of showed me this map and said, "You're planning a secret operation of the British SAS. They're going to come over the Brazilian border and come in and blow up all our planes." And I said, "Why are you saying that?" He said, "Those crosses, that's the operation." I said, "Those crosses were done for me by a Jesuit friend, because those crosses are where the Jesuit missions were way back in the 16th, 15th century, at which point they didn't know what to say. But the end of that episode involved, as you can probably imagine, a lot of diplomatic secret intervention on behalf of HMG, and thank God I had some friends in the Argentine government who also helped. And I was obviously released to go on writing for another day. And then when I came back from Argentina in '86, I was assigned to cover Northern Ireland, and I covered the what one could call loosely the final stage of the IRA campaign, which obviously involved not just Northern Ireland, but bomb attacks on the mainland, particularly London, the city of London, you probably recall, and the lead up to what eventually became the Good Friday Peace Agreement. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and the world changed. And I was suddenly found myself, after Northern Ireland, being made security and intelligence correspondent and defense, vetted by the agencies, so I could have access to the agencies, MI6, MI5 in particular, and obviously free to develop my sources with the CIA across the Atlantic and with other European intel services. But there I basically got into a whole different ballgame, which is terrorist attacks. I lived the London bombings, had to cover that, and then I happened to be in Madrid when they attacked the trains, the biggest mainland terrorist attack since Lockerbie. Terrible carnage in the main station of Madrid, I will never forget. I also will never forget talking to the rescue workers who went down into the London Underground, telling me the carnage they'd found as a result of the bomb going off into carriages on the London Underground, which I would not even dream of sharing with you tonight. Which I suppose brings me to Walter Bell, the subject of my book. Well, I have got my own copy actually, but I can't find it. Now, Walter comes into my life, or I come into his life, because in '86, as I said, when I came back from Argentina, my late father, an OS, who is the subject of an earlier book of mine called Papa Spy, which probably gives you an idea of what the book's about, if those of you who haven't read it. My father was in British intelligence during World War II. Suddenly said to me, there's a friend of mine who would like to take you for lunch at the Travellers Club in London, the Travellers Club being a well-known haunt of various spies, because he's very, very interested in learning everything you've learnt in Argentina and talking to you about the world and all that. So I met this guy who was my father's age, 40 years difference between us. Tall, veteran, but sort of, well-dressed, well-spoken, quite discreet. By the time I got there, I think he'd had 3 dry martinis already in the downstairs bar, and we finished off a claret over lunch. So as a result of that, we got to know each other quite well. And from there began a sort of, I would say, a sort of, they never had children, almost a sort of, a very close relationship almost with his wife as well, of he saw in me a bit about what he might have been when he was younger. Anyway, sort of quite a sort of almost like substitute parents, although I had my parents of my own. And for them, I was like a kind of the son they'd never had. And so I used to go and see them quite regularly. And Walter, to be fair to him, never once told me that he was working with British intelligence. He would say that he'd worked in the Foreign Service and that he'd been in interesting places, but he never said, I'm a MI6, nor did I actually ask him, although I suspected that he was. And then Walter dies in 2004, and if any of you can look it up on the internet, if you look up his obit in the Times, it was a whole full-page obit. And it was one of those obits that sort of tells you rather less than the true story, because it doesn't mention that he was an MI6, barely mentions that he was an MI5, and simply talks about his foreign service during World War II and in the post-war. But what was striking was the 2 awards that he'd been given. On the British side, the CMG, which is probably one of the highest awards that anyone in government service can get, the Call Me God, as they say in Whitehall. And then on the other side of the Atlantic, the Order of Freedom, which is given only by the US president, and has only gone to very, very few non-Americans. And that was for his cooperation with the Americans during World War II. But having read the obituary, the next thing that happened was that I got a phone call from his wife, Tatty, who was American. She happened to be the oldest daughter of General Spaatz, who was Eisenhower's favorite general, the head of the American Air Force and the whole Allied Air Force during World War II, who said, Jimmy, can you come around to the flat? I want to talk to you about something very special. And so I went round and I found Tatty in her drawing room. So it's almost like yesterday, surrounded by boxes with papers coming out of the boxes. And she went straight to it and she said, look, what you see there are Walter's personal papers covering his entire life, which he's kept secret till now. And it was his wish, and it's my wish, that you have these papers to do with them what you might want to do with them. And I think, I took that as read, that knowing that I'd already written several books, that I knew Walter and Walter knew me, that that I would look at the papers very carefully and then consider whether there was a book in it. Believe it or not, that was 2004. I didn't really get down to it till COVID. You might say, how did I miss that opportunity right from the start? Well, I was writing other books, not least a biography of Pope Francis, a biography of Messi and Ronaldo, a new edition on my biography of Diego Maradona. So I had quite a lot to get on with, and also looking after growing up 2 daughters. But when COVID came, my wife, with her good Irish blood, said, if you don't do something with those boxes, I'm going to shred them, because they're taking up the entire bloody house, and it's a complete mess, so many papers. So I sat down for the first time and really started ordering the papers and looking at them. And, I realized that it was pure treasure. To put it, pure treasure for any researcher, for any journalist. and there was definitely a public interest in seeing if I could shape this into a book, which involved, first of all, ordering the papers, which were in a complete mess. So I ordered them in various episodes of his life, from his childhood through to his recruitment by MI6, and then when he moves to MI5 post-war. Now, at this point, given that we're going into the book, can we just see, again, Elliot's absolutely fantastic quick shot promo, but it's more than that. It's got a third man feel about it. You know, I mean, this man is a director in the making.
In a world of secrets, betrayal, and intrigue, one man stood at the heart of it all. Journeying into the hidden world of espionage and diplomacy as we unveil the remarkable story of Walter Bell. Drawing on previously undisclosed personal papers, this groundbreaking book reveals the untold stories of the relationship between Britain and America during World War II and the Cold War. From London to Kenya and India to the West Indies, Bell's influence spread across the globe. He played a crucial role in passing the power to newly independent governments and developed close ties with presidents, prime ministers and politicians, as well as generals, judges and journalists. A man that worked tirelessly to protect British interests and reputation during the turbulent times of the Cambridge Fire affair, after being awarded with honours such as the CMG and the US Medal of Freedom. A faithful spy uncovers the inner workings of British intelligence and espionage, as told by the former security and intelligence correspondent of the Financial Times and prize-winning author Ginny Burns.
Yeah, he deserves it. The prize-winning author Julian Barnes has this definition. I know there's a budding historian here, and I'm sure some of the poetry historians are here as well. And he describes history is the certainty produced at the point where the imperfections of memory meet the inadequacies of documentation. Now, I think that quote absolutely encapsulates the challenge I had, because I had these papers, but the journalistic instinct in me, and I'm an investigative journalist, was that, and also I'm an academic as well, I'm a historian, was that I couldn't take for granted that everything he was saying was the truth. I had to test it, and I had to widen my research to primary sources, people who'd known him. I talked a lot to his family, who were incredibly cooperative, some of his former colleagues, and I also did a lot of archive work, looking at declassified documents in National Archives in Kew, Churchill Archives in Cambridge, the FBI files in the States, and countless others. And I realized that there was actually very little about Walter, which led me to believe that he was very, very classified, and that I would everything that was in there was probably stuff that his own employers had never imagined he'd kept, which is a challenge for me and a risk for me, and a risk which I took, knowing that I wasn't breaching the Official Secrets Act. And why did I feel that? Because there was nothing in there that named agents. And the Official Secrets Act, and also MI6's refusal to condone certain publications, is that if you start allowing everyone to name agents, you'll never have an intelligence service, because intelligence service is based on agents, and it has repercussions for their families and their inheritors, and it's not a good thing to do. But I've got a series of slides here, which Rachel very nicely Elliot's put together, and Rachel is going to which will probably take you through the main headlines of Walter's story. But I think I would just begin with reading you this extraordinary how he got recruited, and in 1934, which it reads like a novel, but it's how it actually happened. Remember, this guy was 26 at the time, 25, going on to 26. On a late autumn afternoon in 1934, a tall young man with a slight stoop made his way along a cold and seemingly deserted residential road near Westminster Central, London. Queen Anne's Gate was one of the capital's most elegant streets, lined with fine late 18th century houses regarded by many architects as the best of their kind. He stopped for a moment in front of number 21 and, no doubt with a sharp intake of breath, walked up to the front door and pressed the doorbell. Walter Bell, I say he was age 24 at the time, had come to Queen Anne's Gate to attend an interview for a job he knew next to nothing about, other than the fact that it offered him a change from his hitherto rather dull life. As he stepped over the threshold, he could scarcely have imagined that the role he was about to take on would shape the course of world events and mark his performance in the unfolding drama. These were politically turbulent times, echoes of the times we live today, in which to make one's way in life. The year 1934 had the world convulsed and seemingly on the edge of worse calamities to come. With the Great Depression taking the global economy to rock bottom, people turned to whatever and whoever promised them a better life. In the fledgling power that was the US, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was under increasing political pressure from those who believed that certain aspects of the New Deal, mobilizing the power and resources of the federal government to address the issues of poverty and inequality, were an unconstitutional overreach, and others who felt it did not go far enough. With the US seemingly turning in on itself, elsewhere more extreme leaders were fueling people's fears and prejudices to rally support and create a scapegoat for the world's problems. At the end of June 1934, Adolf Hitler, Germany's newly self-declared Führer, had carried out a brutal extrajudicial action against opponents, the so-called Night of the Long Knives, the latest evidence for those who did not wish to appease him that he stood outside civilized politics. In Russia, Stalin was beginning his own massacres, while in China, Mao Zedong was spreading the communist doctrine. Closer to home, Oswald Mosley's black shirts were organizing fascist rallies and clashed with communists and Jews on the streets of East London, while radical students and some of their professors embraced Marxism as the only alternative to fascism. A vicar's son with a generally conservative appearance, Bell seemed unlikely material for political firebrand, but his politics were radically left-wing, and he had a sense of adventure and confidence that made him feel ready to tackle the world. The interview came at a time when he wanted a new challenge, motivated as much by anger as a desire to change politics as by curiosity. It marked a crossroads in his life and a time for reflection. Now, Rachel, we just kick off with, well, that's a picture of Walter, which you've already seen in the earlier clip, which is basically, he passed what was then called the Oxford and Cambridge certification examination while he was at Tunbridge School, which of course entitled him to go to either Cambridge or Oxford. But his parents had fallen on bad times at the time. His father was a vicar, his mother was an artist, and they said they couldn't afford to send him to Oxbridge. So he found himself taking on various teaching jobs and various prep schools over the next 4 or 5 years. You can go to the next one. He developed, first of all, a passion for travel, and he went to Northern Europe. He went to Germany, he went to Austria. He witnessed at first hand all the horrible things that were going on, particularly in Germany with the Nazis. But at the same time, he was a consummate social networker and beginning to make friends, people in high places, including this gentleman here, who was Viscount Elmley of the Beaufort family, later immortalized in Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh, one of the most oldest aristocratic families. He was an MP. His cousins were in British intelligence. He was a man with quite a lot of influence, and one of several people that Walter met, who led to him literally having a tap on his shoulder and saying, why don't you come for an interview at Queen Anne's Gate? Can we move on? That is Queen Anne's Gate today. It's obviously no longer the MI6 headquarters, which are probably more familiar to you from that watching James Bond is true, including one where he's actually in the MI6 building in Vauxhall Cross, visible to everyone. But that's where the MI6 headquarters used to be right up and beyond World War II. Go on. This was one of, in the papers that I had for Waters, I had all his passports. And this passport was the first passport he was issued on his first job as deputy head of the MI6 station in New York, where he arrived in 1935. And it just says here, His Majesty's Foreign Service. So obviously it doesn't say deputy head of MI6. Can we go on? Walter was a young bachelor when he arrived. Obviously, was well-bred, well-spoken, good-looking, and he obviously had a sense of enjoyment and obviously attraction to the opposite sex, and that was one of several girlfriends that he picked up in America. But less frivolously, he was actually doing an important job, which was what one calls in intelligence a kind of an intelligence officer of influence, because MI6's job was to try and get the Americans on board, as Churchill was warning, to support Britain in taking on Hitler. And it's certain parallels with a certain Trump now, but one has to remind oneself what the atmosphere was like in the United States in the late 1930s. It was an opinion poll in 1937-38. A Gallup poll showed that only 13% of the Americans were in favor of joining the Second World War. Because they said we were tricked into the First World War. In the last months of the First World War, 22,000 of our boys died simply because the Brits brought us in. Well, we don't want to go through all this. This is a distant European war. We don't want to get involved. Certain echoes in terms of if Trump gets into the presidency with what's going on in Ukraine. Next one. Again, this looks slightly frivolous, but in fact, he was a very keen skier. And of course, being in New York, he would go off to Vermont and wonderful places like that to ski. But his skiing trips were always skiing trips where he met his sources and developed information and also influencing attitudes, particularly among journalists, among people in the State Department. Remember, at that time, you did not have the CIA. You didn't have, the Americans did not have a foreign intelligence service. There was the FBI, but the FBI had focused till then simply on internal policing, forensic stuff. Next one, please. Well, this is one of the letters that basically jumped out of the page at me, literally, among his papers. It is a strictly personal, a letter dated 1942, signed by J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, thanking Walter for his continuing and very important cooperation with the FBI and with other agencies. Now, Walter, by that time, was the main MI6 liaison, not just with the FBI, but with the nascent US intelligence service, foreign intelligence, the OSS, which was founded in 1942 with Roosevelt's blessing and indeed with Churchill's blessing. And it initially wanted to mirror what MI6 was doing and also what SOE was doing in terms of covert operations. So Walter was liaising with the Americans on this. By that time, his team had at least succeeded with Churchill's personal relationship with Roosevelt, obviously also helping in getting the Americans into the war. And in autumn of 1942, Walter was relocated to London because at that time, London was getting inundated with the first officers of the OSS. So the whole American UK intelligence relationship was shifting to London, to the European theatre, France obviously under occupation, most of Europe under occupation, and plans underfoot to start doing the pushback, which involved a lot of covert operations and a lot of intelligence gathering on, for instance, German prisoners of war, and covert operations of sabotage and various things that were going on, which Walter was very much involved in. Can we go to the next one? This is a British security coordination. It was a highly secretive setup that was set up by MI6 in New York. Once Churchill had become Prime Minister and a war had been declared, and it basically straddled propaganda, counterintelligence, intelligence, right across the board, and liaison with the Americans. And it basically says what it says there. Walter Bell, a member of the British Security Coordination, has performed valuable service of a confidential nature between 1940 and 1945. Yep. His boss was a guy called Bill Stevenson, who is a Canadian, who himself was honoured by the Americans. This guy is Bill Donovan, who was the first director of the first US intelligence agency of the OSS, which then morphed into the CIA post-war. Next one, please. This is General Spatz, I mentioned before, who was Walter's father-in-law. So you can imagine there was nothing that Walter didn't know about the Americans, and he had sort of pretty high-level access to probably information that no other Brit had. Keep going. That's a rather remarkable photograph I dug up of Tatty, of Walter's wife, who he married in 1948. But she was quite a formidable lady, and I knew her, obviously, as I mentioned, when she was alive. But she insisted to her father that she wasn't going to simply spend the war in America being a spoilt, upper-class American living in Georgetown. She wanted to do her bit for the cause, and she insisted on going and joining in East Anglia and Cambridge, where the Americans were based, the so-called flying bomber command, which some of you might be watching on Apple TV, produced by Spielberg, follow-up to Brothers in Arms, called Masters of the Sky. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. Tatty has a bit part in it because women hardly feature. That's my only criticism of the thing. It's totally male-orientated, just as Brothers in Arms was, as if women hadn't existed. The women are there to dance, do the swing, produce donuts, give them Coca-Cola, coffee. But in fact, they were part of a very important psychological operation to make these poor pilots, and most of whom weren't coming back from their operations because they're getting shot down, feel as if they were back in the States. Keep going. This is when Walter married Tatty. There's the British flag with the American flag there. They got married in America, in Washington. Keep going. This was the head of the OSS operation in Europe, based in London, who was Walter's opposite number, a guy called David Bruce, who eventually, for those interested in diplomatic history, became one of the US ambassadors to Britain during the Kennedy years, and was a highly esteemed intelligence operative during the war and a highly esteemed diplomat as well. Keep going. This was Sir Stuart Mingus, who was head of MI6 in World War II, and obviously Walter's boss. He's been quite criticised for various things, not least for allowing the Cambridge Five to get away with it for so long, given that they were recruited by the Russians in the 1930s. And that was because of the sort of old boy club network, and because Philby spoke with the right accent and knew the right people. And anyway, that's another story, although I do talk about the Cambridge Five in the book, and I can answer questions about that at Q&A, because Walter knew three of them. He worked with Philby, he worked with Donald Maclean in the Washington Embassy in the British Embassy in Washington, and he also met Guy Burgess. Keep going. This is indeed when Walter was, in 1946, appointed as private secretary to Lord Inverchapel, the first post-war British ambassador of Washington, and the first British ambassador nominated by a Labour government, the first post-war Labour government. This is Inverchapel, this is Walter, both with identical Savile Row pinstripe suits, which I find quite amusing. Inverchapel was, as some of you will know, historians, was an extremely eccentric character. He had previously been ambassador to Moscow and got on rather well with Stalin. And Stalin, as a farewell present, gave him a valet and a masseuse, the same person doing the two things together, to take him to Washington, which of course led to quite a row in the House of Commons, with people accusing Inverchapel possibly of being a Soviet agent, which he never was. But it became quite a parliamentary storm at the time, and Inverchapel was forced to tell his valet, who he rather respected, that he had to go, but don't worry, I'll give you a job back in my Scottish estate. And so Sveng, as he was called, ended up working in Inverchapel's Scottish estate, marrying a Scotswoman, and ending up running a fish and chip shop. So you could almost write another From Russia with Love, but it would have turned into a rather different movie. Keep going. Now, Walter, in 1948, moves, and this is very unusual, moves from MI6 to MI5. MI5 come to him, and they recruit him. And you might say, why do you go from a foreign service to what's basically a security service? Well, that's because at that time, under a thing called the Attlee Directive, named after Attlee, Attlee had given MI5 priority for foreign intelligence in the colonies and in the Commonwealth. So MI5 stations in places like India, Africa, were almost like MI6 stations are today. And they obviously wanted to draw on Walter's experience. And so he gets sent with Tati, obviously, at the end of the 1940s, to Kenya, to Nairobi, in the run-up to Mau Mau. The Mau Mau insurgency, as some of you know, this was obviously an unpublished photograph of the many I've published in the book, which was in the Bell archive, as it were, which shows them planning what ended up being a sort of terrible repression of the Africans, concentration camps, thousands of Africans dying, not a happy period in terms of British imperial or post-imperial history or colonial history, which subsequently, many years later, became the subject of a huge human rights legal action in the High Court of London. But Walter's papers make it very, very clear that he was thought that the colonial authorities and that London had it completely wrong, that they didn't understand the causes of this brewing insurrection, which was basically total disregard for land rights of the African, racism by the colonial authorities, exclusion of the African from positions of any kind of authority in their own country. Walter actually pulled out before that the repression of Mau Mau actually got underway. But something important happened to him, and this, as I sort of conclude the talk, plays to the title of the book, A Faithful Spy. Walter, being born into an Anglican vicarage, little vicarage in a village in Kent, had become very disillusioned with his father's, I think, pretty exploitative attitude towards his position, to the point that he actually, at one point, took his own son's confession and would insist that his son would write down all his sins on a piece of paper and then go and see his father, which is totally inadmissible, really. And he became very disillusioned with that side of religion. But while he was in Kenya, he became hugely impressed by the humility and dedication and service to others of the Irish missionaries who were working in the slums of Nairobi. And he converted to Roman Catholicism while he was on his first posting. After Kenya, he went to India. That is B.S. Malik, probably not a name familiar for most of you, but he was Nehru's spy supremo. He was head of the Indian first post-independence Indian spy service, which is very big. It's a big country, and he was the second most powerful person in India after Nehru. Walter befriended him and got on like a house on fire with him. Keep going. This is Walter and Tati. The third most powerful person in India was the Chief of Staff, the Army Chief of Staff, called General Chowdhury, ex-Sandhurst man, being decorated by the British. Incredible source of intelligence for Walter. Keep going. This is Walter on home leave, already taking on the air of a slightly less frivolous person than the one you saw early on. Happily married to Tati, an enduring marriage, by the way. Keep going. This was Roger Hollis, Director General of MI5, who Walter was private secretary and head of the office to for a year and a half back in London. So that was quite an interesting time for him as well. Keep going. This was Guy Liddell, who was the deputy head of Director General of MI5. Both Hollis and Liddell were accused by certain tabloids and certain cowboy authors of being Russian moles. As it turned out, this was complete baloney, but it was actually misinformation fed by the Soviets, aimed at sort of literally demoralizing the whole structure of British intelligence post-Cambridge 5, where trying to make the public think that the entire organization had been infiltrated by the Russians, which it hadn't. And Walter and his... keep going. I will come back to that in a later photograph. This is, some of you familiar with this, but probably for not the reasons I'm going to tell you now. He is C.L.R. James, who is a great cricket expert from Trinidad, but he was also a Marxist, politician, and a journalist in Trinidad when Walter was posted to the West Indies, and one of the sources that he developed, secret sources that he developed in the West Indies at a time when the West Indies was pre-Cuban Revolution, was getting quite volatile. Keep going. And this is Jomo Kenyatta. Jomo Kenyatta, most extraordinary, his friendship with Walter Bell, Walter Bell's friendship with him. As I mentioned earlier, on Walter's first posting to Kenya, Walter had argued consistently that Kenyatta was not the devil that the colonial authorities were trying to make out, responsible for Mau Mau and all that, but he was a kind of the then equivalent of a Nelson Mandela, sort of a nascent African nationalist leader that deserved to be listened to and also taken into account in terms of a future independent government. And so you find the most extraordinary situation where in 1961, when the decolonization of Kenya was gathering steam, and Kenyatta had been identified as very much the person who was going to become the first post-independence head of government, head of state in Kenya. Kenyatta asked for Walter Bell and MI5 to advise him on security because he felt that the Russians were infiltrating Kenya and organizing coups against him and infiltrating the universities, infiltrating the media. And he'd heard about Walter Bell, someone who understands African nationalism. I trust him. And with the blessing of MI5, Walter Bell became Jomo Kenyatta's security advisor, obviously as liaison with MI5 from 61 to 67, at which point, next one, Walter retires. Now, I mentioned before Horace and Liddell being accused of being moles. This is a guy called Dick White, probably the most important person in post-war British intelligence history because he was the only person to become head of MI5 and head of MI6. Deeply involved in the whole saga of the Cambridge Five. One of the reasons he moved from one agency to the other was that he was trusted to get to the bottom of what was really going on. And the one thing he absolutely felt very strongly was that both Liddell and Hollis were not working for the Russians. So he got together with his colleague and good friend, Walter Bell, and again, never disclosed before, and I write about it in the book. Together they did what was called a damage limitation exercise, but they organized covertly an operation to clear the names of these two people, which involved the Times. And the story is all in the book if you want to get into it. I won't get into the detail now. Keep going. Okay, so we're coming to the end of this, but that is a rather younger Jimmy Burns with a rather older Walter Bell, Tat in the background. And I think the photograph probably speaks for itself. Next one. And the final one is probably the last photograph ever taken of Walter, and it's a happy one because he lived to a ripe old age, as indeed Tatty did. But he at that time that photograph was taken actually at the house on the coast of Spain. Belonging to my parents, because of course Walter and my father, because of their intelligence background, were great friends. And so he was on gardening, he called it gardening leave, because Walter would come out to Spain with Tatty and spend most of the time helping out, with the garden. And Tatty, to my mother's Spanish mother's not great delight, decided that Spanish cooking was not healthy and that they all had to have microbiotic rice, which did not go very well with my Spanish mother, but that's another story. And that's, I think, it's a very sweet letter. And I just want to finish because I think it goes back to a faithful spy. And I just want to end with just the psychology of the spy. There is a term used in the world of espionage, which is developing the camel's back syndrome. What that means is it is a psychological condition which manifests itself in depression, and some people just break down completely. After World War II, this is not widely known, but a lot of people emerged from World War II and had breakdowns. They never recovered. I'm not just talking about, obviously, post-traumatic stress disorder is now more widely recognized, but I'm not obviously those soldiers, but people in intelligence. But the camel back syndrome is when the burden of knowing so much and being able to say so little in public just becomes almost impossible to carry on your shoulders. People crack under the strain. And Walter, what I realized was suffering at that at various points in his life, but he fought against it. And he was also a very complex character. Many times I was with him, I realized the conflict that comes through his papers. He was a socialist, but then he also, great social networker. And at the end of the day, I had to ask my question, was he the sixth man of the Cambridge Five? And I came to the conclusion he wasn't. And you can read the book where I explain why I don't think he was the sixth man. On the contrary, I conclude my book, and I'll conclude my talk with saying this. Like so many in secret intelligence, Bell was a complex, ambiguous character and could be elusive, with motives that were not always quite what they seemed. He was no knight in shining armor and was prone to human and professional failings, as identified in the pages of this book. But he had integrity, a man of faith with a strong moral sense of justice and a belief in democracy. He still found space for nuance and irony, for a lightness that contrasted with the heaviness of ideology that turned some of his generation towards extremes of intolerance and even betrayal. Not that betrayal would ever have been an option for Walter Bell. Loyal to his church, to his friends, to his family, colleagues, king and country, he was a truly faithful spy. Thank you. Now, I've overrun, but I'm sure Michael will forgive me. But do ask some questions, and I'd really appeal first of all to the back row. So, back row, any questions? Yeah, can you talk out so everyone can hear you? Yeah, including I'm half deaf in one ear from an IRA bomb, by the way. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't quite get that. So.
Because from what I understood, you wrote 3 biographies.
Different biographies, yeah.
What made you decide about these certain people?
Yes, it might be quite perplexing how it is that someone writes about Maradona, Pope Francis, Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi, and my father, Papa Spy, and this. Well, I suppose that anyone who knows me, I've always sort of, as a journalist, sort of, and again, I learned this at Stonyhurst. I was lucky because I've still got the reports, but in grammar, I wasn't good at sport. I know all the rugby lot have gone off to see rugby, but I wasn't particularly interested in rugby. I wasn't good at cricket, but the one thing that it was identified was that I really like writing, I like reading, and that I was curious about things. So in my journalism, and I owe it to the Financial Times, which is I think the greatest newspaper in the world to work for, as a foreign correspondent, and also when I was brought back to London HQ, I was given an incredible range of experiences, which again gave me a very open mind. It included actually reporting on football, because they knew it was one of my passions. Hard to believe, but when I was here in this college, I had to go to the Jesuits, and most of them were Jesuits at the time, and say, why is it that everyone plays rugby when most of the people I know beyond these college walls play football or go and watch football? And so, well, very typical enlightened Jesuit said, all right, Jimmy, well, if you feel that way, why don't you form the first football team in Stonyhurst, which I did. I also formed the most rebellious cricket team called the Bats and Balls Club, which the only condition was that you wore jeans and T-shirt, and took on the first 11, and we sometimes we beat them, but that's just anecdotal. Okay, so in reply to your question, I think there are lots of things. I mean, not lots of things. There are things which I feel quite passionate about, and which I've always taken an interest in. I've always been interested in cultures, in different cultures. I am bicultural, bilingual in Spanish and English and French and whatever. I fell in love with Latin America, so I wrote the Falklands book. Pope Francis, I was commissioned to write Pope Francis for obvious reasons, because I lived in Argentina and he was the first Argentine Pope. Not only that, I'd been educated by the Jesuits. So, 2 days after he was elected, I had a big publisher on to me saying, we want a biography. And the only thing I said to them, well, you're not going to have it in 6 months. I need at least a year to do this, which thank God I did, because, I did a lot of research and went back to Argentina and all that. And then the sort of the football stuff is basically, I've always been interested in biographies, but biographies that really get to the person. To try and get into the psychology of the person, what motivates the person, the circumstances, the family relations, the friendships develop. It all forms the personality of a person. That's always fascinated me. And the book about Maradona is basically a book about addiction. It's a book about what terrible things happen when a genius of the football pitch, that was Diego Maradona, starts taking hard drugs. And he was the final football rock star, because he just burnt himself out. He wouldn't have existed today in the Premier. He would have dropped dead within a week under Pep Guardiola or Klopp or any of the current managers, because they're really pushed. And I suppose that's a long way of answering your question, but I just being quite open to that. And the book about my father really took me into intelligence, but it was really a book, as I explained at the time, and I think I gave a talk about it here. What stimulated that was actually the war memorial down at Stonyhurst, because I was always very conscious that all the names there were all people, OS people, who were honoured by the college, and the one question that was in my mind was, what did you do in the war, Daddy? Because he never talked about it. He didn't have any medals, and he didn't say he'd been in the trenches and shooting at Germans and all that. And it was only subsequently I gradually realised why, because he'd been working for intelligence, and there were things that he couldn't talk about for many, many years. And I suppose, having written a book about one spy, when I got the papers for Walter Bell, that was another whole new ball game, really, because my father's book was basically on wartime Spain, because he was in the British Embassy in Madrid. Walter, as I've described, was a career sort of straddling MI6, MI5 in several countries. Yeah.
If the Cold War had heated up, do you think Walter's loyalty may have shifted, or would he stay patriotic to Britain?
If the Cold War had heated up, what?
As in Russia starting a conventional war?
Oh, I see. Yeah, so really going for it. Well, I mean, the one thing that I think, I gleaned from his papers, but also from, as I said, the additional research I did, because I had to, for my own professional integrity, be damn sure that he hadn't become a Soviet spy, because that would have been a different book, okay? And I won't go into the detail, but there were various things that I was told that led me to believe beyond, on the balance of probability, or the whatever the judicial term you want to use, that he was not a Russian spy, and he wasn't a Russian spy basically because he became a Catholic. And whereas Philby, and if you read what Philby's written, and Maclean to a certain extent, forget about Burgess. Burgess was an alcoholic drunk. I mean, how anyone ever recruited him to do anything is quite extraordinary. But Philby, from the 30s onwards, when he was at university, I mean, he honestly, his faith, his church, was the Communist Party, beyond any criticism. So, for me, the extraordinary thing about the Cambridge Five, and I know some people tend to romanticize them, and so many books have been written about them, some of them written in a way that you almost think they're heroes. What was going on in Russia at the time was just appalling. It even makes Putin look, Putin's almost there now. But Stalin was, in the 30s, was appalling. And Philby knew all this, but for him, what mattered was, he was a kind of doctrinal, ultramontane Catholic who hadn't lived the Vatican II, and just thinks that, the Inquisitions still exist and all that. No, it was so. And Walter, I think, was saved by, even in the 1930s, when all this was going on, he gradually shifted away from his socialism, which he developed when he was a young man, because he was anti-fascist. He began reading quite a lot into Catholic social teaching. People like Jacques Maritain, Christopher Dawson, who was an old OS boy, who was writing a lot in the 1930s about the third way between fascism and communism. And the third way was Catholic social teaching, which is on the side of justice, on the side of democracy, on the side of the poor, but it's actually the gospel message as enunciated by Pope Francis. But certain Catholic thinkers were already talking about it at that time. And then, of course, he goes to Africa, and he lives at first hand the sort of appalling, huge gulf between the rich colonials living like kings and the slums of Nairobi. And he sees the Irish missionaries, as I mentioned, and the humility of those missionaries living among the poor is what turned him to his conversion. And all I can say is that, when I knew Walter, he was going to Mass every day, which not everyone does, but because his house was near the oratory, so he would go to the oratory every day to Mass. And he left very specific instructions for his Requiem Mass, which included actually me giving the eulogy, which I did, which is another story, because at the end there are all these strange anonymous figures who turned up, who were obviously all ex-spies or retired spies, and one came up and gave me his card and said, "Very interesting what you know in water. Do keep in touch," that sort of stuff. But no, I think that the faith, going back to the faithful spy, what was the sort of as Proust would say, what was in his memory and what actually turned his personality into what it became. I think one was his relationship with his wife. It's very unusual in the intelligence world for any marriages to keep together. Him and Tatty kept together through thick and thin, right to the end, in a mutually supportive, very loving relationship. The other one was his faith, and I think it's sad that he actually didn't go to the Jesuits. Instead, he went to Tunbridge School, which was high Anglican, with a huge reputation for bullying. He didn't like Tunbridge at all, and one of his predecessors at Tunbridge, from many years earlier, E.M. Forster, wrote in one of his books that if you wanted to understand the philistinism and snobbery of the British Empire, you had to look at the formation that certain public schools give to their pupils. But I mean, obviously, E.M. Forster was referring to Tunbridge, and I think going back to Stonyhurst, where I began, I do believe that that there is a certain ethical dimension to Stonyhurst, which certainly I carry within me. I've always carried it within me right through my professional career. Yeah.
There's 2 or 3 things in the lecture that sort of struck home. There was a letter signed by William Stevenson, a director of
Security coordination, yeah.
That's right. Now, that impinged on something I did many years afterwards. I worked for Texaco. I was in charge of marketing chemicals in Europe. Texaco had a very, very strange policy. Thou shalt not deal with any enemy of the United States or any potential enemy of the United States. Now you think that's fairly broad, and you sort of think, why?
Yeah.
Bill Stevenson, who was a very interesting man, he was a Canadian multimillionaire,
Absolutely.
and he was British intelligence in the United States. And one of the things he found out that the president of Texaco, not only was he right-wing in the States, he was a Nazi, and very, very close to some of the senior Nazis in Germany. To the extent that when war was declared between the States and Germany, Germany appropriated the Texaco refineries in Germany. 5 oil tankers left Germany under the German flag. And somewhere between there and Texas, they adopted a US flag. Texaco were paid in tankers for the appropriation by the Nazis. The chief lawyer of Texaco at the time, like a lot of people in the States of German heritage, was actually a positive spy. He was, from what I learned was that his code were pattern numbers. So he had a legitimate reason to be sending letters backwards and forwards, and his codes were,
But he was a German agent.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a good example, of course, of the importance, when Roosevelt realized that the states were going to get involved sooner or later, and then, of course, did become involved, the Pentagon was doing projections. We will have 5,000 tanks, 10,000 trucks, etc., etc. That information went to Texaco and ESO as well. How much oil will we need? How much oil can you produce, etc. All that went to Germany. So that was
Fascinating.
Bill Stevenson. His code name, I don't know if you know this, his code name was called Intrepid.
Intrepid, yeah, yeah. Very fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Which, of course, again, there's a lot of detail in the book. But when I mentioned that in 1941, which are obviously before, as you know, the States entered the war, Bill Stevenson sends water bell to Mexico. And he is responsible for scuppering an attempt by the Germans to run the oil embargo out of Temuco. And it involved MI6 actually liaising with the US Navy. And although the US was officially on neutral patrol duty, the Germans got so shit scared that they scuppered all their ships or they went back to port. So it was one of Bill Stevenson's great victories. That, but it's interesting that this Texaco stuff is absolutely fascinating. It's very.
Now, the other thing I was going to mention, you talked about when you first became a spy, and etc. In the early 50s, anti-communism was rife. We had Korea, we
Yeah.
had Malaya, the whole lot. 12 years later, I was positively vetted, and they knew that I had applied 12 years earlier to become a member of the Communist Party.
So you were on an MI5 file, yeah. You were on an MI5 file. Yes. How fascinating. Yes. Very, very interesting. Both your things, yeah.
You brought up that Walter was in the States in 1935.
Yeah.
At that time, Lindbergh was causing a lot of problems to Roosevelt to enter the war.
Yeah.
Was he part of the process of trying to market against and sell to the Germans all kinds of issues so that effectively they could make America enter the war more quickly? They were marketing I think you mentioned Stevenson, wasn't he involved in that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things there was quite a lot of call it black propaganda or misinformation or fake news, I mean, there were certain things that were being fed by Stevenson's outfit into the American media.
Was Walter part of that?
Yeah, he was. Yeah. But it was all part of trying to get the Americans into the things. So you had things on Latin America, the German conspiracies in Latin America that went into that and all that. Yeah, he was very much part of that.
Thank you.
I'm very conscious of.
Yeah, and we've got our fish and chips to go to. Yeah, good. All right, that's it.
I wasn't going to mention that, but there will be some time just for informal questions.
Yeah, well, we'll take one more, and then okay.
I'll try to keep this very brief.
Very
Thank
brief.
you ever so much for introducing a very interesting person, and it just goes to show in history that history is written in the shadows rather than the names, the kings and the emperors that form history. That people do things that could change the side of history so profoundly, and we don't know about them until many years after they did what they did. I'd like to ask a very brief question about the special relationship.
Yeah.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and the idea that we have a global world that's becoming more fractionalised now, and America's retreating back to the Western Hemisphere, and the need for new relationships. And obviously, we had a special relationship. We still have one with Five Eyes and the Anglosphere as such. But the fact that the United States is onshoring its manufacturing with NAFTA and the relationships with Mexico and the demographics that happen in the United States as well. If we're going to position ourselves with the United States and perhaps other Hispanic-speaking countries as well, do we need Walter Bells to make that happen and to make sure that we have those channels of communication going. And the reason why I asked that question is, a couple of days ago, I saw a film behind the scenes of the new president of Argentina hugging former President Trump at a
Yeah, sure.
conference.
Yeah.
And it's about making sure that, well, the European connections with the United States can be maintained rather than the populist connections elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously, the short answer is, you know, there is still the special relationship. Certainly with Biden, there's a special relationship, and there are people working on it constantly, and there's hotlines between the British Prime Minister and the American President, and as you say, Five Eyes includes the Australians, the Canadians, and the New Zealanders. So, you know, that's a sharing of intelligence that, say, we don't share with the Europeans necessarily, or any other country. But I think, you know, the key, you know, just bring it to the present day. I mean, obviously, the Ukraine thing has presented a sort of, in a sense, in our lifetime, an unprecedented challenge, because, you know, it's the first time that you know, the whole of European security is challenged, so therefore, what we've seen on the positive side is obviously a kind of unity of purpose, not just in the special relationship, but also Europe coming together in a way one couldn't have imagined 5 years ago. Okay. The negative side of that, or the shadows, which you're all more than familiar with, is Trump going to win the next presidency? Now, you know, my personal view, I might be proved wrong, and maybe I'm just an optimist. I don't think he will win the next presidency for various reasons, but I think I also have faith in the better side of history prevailing. But I think if Trump does become president, all bets are off, not least what kind of country the United States becomes, you know. Because the thing about Trump, as you know publicly, but I know people who know him pretty well from way, way back, he's incredibly vindictive. There is no sense of respect for your opponent, absolutely none at all. He just believes in revenge and, you know, in crushing people. When he was running Trump Towers, long before his political ambitions, you know, to negotiate, I knew a top Wall Street banker who was representing a purchase of something that was that Trump was interested in, and he said you sat in front of Trump, and you know, normally in a negotiation you put your position, the other person puts his position, then you try and meet somewhere in the middle. Trump would just say, "This is my position. You're going to go with it. I'm not leaving this room till you've taken it." You know, and that's, I think, very, very dangerous for U.S. president. And you know, on the positive side, there's touch wood, but you know, as we speak, there's some incredibly top secret negotiations going on involving my namesake, no relation, John Burns is head of the CIA, the head of Mossad, the Qataris, which obviously, because Hamas have offices in Qatar, representing hotline to Hamas, to try and reach some sort of deal on Gaza, and we'll just watch the space, see what happens. I just, you know, I'm conscious Michael and I need to go for our fish and chips, but the before the Sherman knocks us out. But I just wanted to end actually, because I think it's important, particularly going back to the students here, and hopefully they can share what they've heard with the rugby buffs, if they've still got any time for spies when they get back from drenched from watching rugby. Is that at one level, and it goes back to Walter Bell, you know, one asked the question, you know, you asked it, you know, are there Walter Bells now, you know? at one level, intelligence has completely changed. Okay, why? Because I'm stating the bleeding obvious. We live in an information highway which would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. The generation of the poetry girls back there is a generation that has never lived another life than one with the internet and Google searches and all that. To give you one example, today, if you wanted to find out how long does it take a Russian armored vehicle like a tank or something less heavy to reach 85 kilometers, you can just Google it and get the answer in about maximum 30 seconds. That kind of information only 20 years ago would have involved minimum of 6 months field work by an intelligence officer. We are told a lot about AI, we're told a lot about the threat of cipher wars. This is all true. It requires certainly recruitment of a sort of an analyst, computer-wise, techo-wise, who can keep one step ahead of the Chinese, keep one step ahead of the Russians on this matter. But what has not changed one iota since Walter Bell's time is the importance of human intelligence. Nothing beats having really good sources, and I can tell you that as a journalist. In terms of when it really comes to getting to the bottom of something, you need whistleblowers. You need equivalent agents. You need people you can trust who are giving you the truth, but who are inside there. And we will probably only know. Hopefully, we haven't been sort of blown up with tactical nuclear weapons by then. But the human int on what's going on in Russia at the moment is incredibly high risk for obvious reasons. In China, it is almost impossible to enter China under an alias because you just have to go to a petrol station to fill up your car and it immediately goes into the central data system. They're tracking you from the minute you arrive to the minute you leave. And take it from me, with Putin, we are back to the sort of worst aspect of the Cold War, with someone operationally, just like Stalin, that believes in targeted assassinations. I cover the Litvinenko case, and I can tell you at one point, the agencies did not know how much of Oxford Street had been contaminated by plutonium, which meant the difference between hundreds dying or thousands dying in London. And then we had the Sainsbury's stuff, and then the treatment of this dissident last week. And we'll see what happens on Friday when the funeral takes place. I suspect there's going to be an almighty repression. But I think, as most of us are Catholics, I think, one has to retain a belief in the best in humanity and in what I call the flow of history, actually ending up on the right side. And it is extraordinary to see his widow emerging as a real force of opposition. I mean, quite extraordinary. Overnight, she is emerging every time she gets up to speak. I mean, she had the European Parliament. If she goes to the UN, she'll have that. I mean, Putin has really is reluctant to bump her off. But I mean, God forbid that he doesn't bump her off.
She speaks English. That's a big advantage.
And she speaks English. Yeah. She speaks English. Okay. Is that look? The other thing is obviously Michael has my email. If you've got any other questions, or I'd love to hear more about your experience of Texaco and things. But once you've read the book, if you've got any comments on it or curious about it, I'm more than happy to try and help. And it's been great to have you all here. And thanks so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
clear.
Distinguished historian, lots of books here with book theme. This budding historian here has a book for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.